My mom called me heartless for refusing to cover my brother's rent yet again. It made her furious, and then My name is Alex. I'm 28 years old, living in Denver, Colorado. My life is far from glamorous, but I've worked hard to carve out a corner of stability in a world that often feels chaotic. I rent a modest one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, the kind of place where the walls are so thin I know exactly when my neighbor's dog starts barking and when the baby upstairs decides to cry. The rent creeps up every year, as if the management company thinks we're all secretly millionaires. But it's mine, and I make it work. My day-to-day life is predictable. I get up, put on my work clothes, and head to my corporate job downtown. It's not my dream career, but it's steady and pays the bills. Every dollar I earn has a place. Rent, utilities, groceries, and the ever-present student loan payments that feel like they'll follow me to the grave. I've got my budget down to the penny. There's not much room for extras, but I make it stretch. A streaming subscription here, the occasional happy hour there, and I'm good. For the most part, I like the life I've built. It's not perfect, but it's mine. Then there's Evan, my younger brother. He's 23, fresh out of college, and struggling. Growing up, Evan always had this carefree, live-in-the-moment attitude that seemed charming when we were kids. But now, that same attitude has turned into a string of part-time jobs, temporary gigs, and a financial mess he can't seem to dig himself out of. I love my brother. Don't get me wrong, but his situation has been a mess for as long as I can remember. He's always behind on rent, constantly scrambling to cover his car payments, and perpetually living one small disaster away from hitting rock bottom. About a year ago, he graduated with a degree in environmental studies. At the time, it seemed like a promising choice, but so far, it hasn't led to anything steady. Instead, he's been bouncing between short-term jobs that barely keep his head above water. Over the past year, I've loaned him money twice. The first time, I didn't even hesitate. My mom called me one night, her voice heavy with worry. "Alex, honey, Evan's in trouble," she started. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "He's behind on rent. His landlord's threatening to evict him. He's been trying so hard, but you know how tough it's been for him." I didn't even think about it. I transferred $900 to cover his rent. At the time, I told myself it was a one-time thing, a way to help him get back on track. He promised he'd pay me back as soon as he could. He never did. The second time was about 6 months later. Evan called me directly, panicked and breathless. "Alex, my car's dead," he said. "I can't get to work without it. I don't know what to do." "How much?" I asked, already bracing myself. "$1,200, he said, almost sheepishly. "I know it's a lot, but I swear I'll pay you back as soon as I can." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him to figure it out on his own. But then I thought about what would happen if he couldn't get to work, and I caved. I transferred the money, knowing full well I might never see it again. And I didn't. That's the thing with Evan. He talks a good game about how he's trying to get back on his feet, but nothing ever really changes. He spends money on takeout and streaming subscriptions while his bills pile up. He talks about job interviews that never seem to lead anywhere. It's frustrating, but what's worse is how comfortable he's become with the idea that someone else will always swoop in to save him. Usually, that someone is me. My mom, Margaret, is no help. She's in her mid-50s, and while I love her, she's the kind of mom who thinks it's her job to protect her kids from everything, even their own bad decisions. She always says the same thing when it comes to Evan. "He's just going through a tough time, Alex. We have to stick together as a family." That's what family does. It doesn't matter how many times he messes up or how little effort he puts into fixing his life. To her, Evan is the baby of the family, and it's our job to keep bailing him out. Every time she calls me about Evan, I feel this heavy mix of guilt and frustration. On one hand, I don't want to see him struggle. He's my brother. I care about him. But on the other hand, it's exhausting to keep stepping in when he won't take responsibility for himself. My mom doesn't make it any easier. She has this uncanny ability to turn every conversation into a guilt trip. If I even hint at saying no, she'll remind me of all the sacrifices she made for us growing up. "I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over your heads," she'll say. I didn't complain. I just did what needed to be done. Family sticks together, Alex. That's just how it is. It's not that I don't appreciate what she did for us. I do. But there's a difference between helping someone through a tough time and enabling them to avoid responsibility. The last time she called, I could feel the guilt trip coming before she even opened her mouth. Alex, I need to talk to you about Evan, she said, her tone already pleading. Mom, I can't, I said, cutting her off. I've helped him twice already. I can't keep doing this, she sighed, and I could practically hear her shaking her head on the other end of the line. He looks up to you, Alex, she said. You're his older brother. He needs you. I didn't respond. Because the truth is, I don't think Evan needs me. Not really. What he needs is to grow up. But saying that out loud? It feels impossible. Even now, as I sit here thinking about it, I'm torn. Part of me wants to help him. Part of me wants to scream at him to get his act together. And part of me just wants to disappear from this whole mess. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Something has to change. But I have no idea how to make them see it. A few months after I helped Evan with his rent, I started to notice a pattern. It wasn't just that he wasn't paying me back. It was that he wasn't even trying. He promised to send me something next paycheck, but then he'd forget to bring it up again. When I mentioned it, he'd laugh nervously and say something like, I haven't forgotten, Alex. I'll get to it, I swear. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Life was hard for him, and I wanted to believe he'd make good on his promises. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became that Evan had no intention of paying me back. It wasn't just the money, though. It was his attitude, his complete lack of urgency about his situation. One day, I stopped by his apartment to drop off something Mom had sent for him, a care package filled with groceries and snacks. When I walked in, I was hit by the smell of pizza. Not leftover pizza or a frozen one heated in the oven, but freshly delivered pizza, complete with garlic bread and wings. His living room was cluttered with delivery boxes, and a shiny new gaming controller sat on the coffee table. Nice setup, I said, gesturing to the controller. Oh, yeah, he said, grinning. Had to replace the old one. It wasn't working right anymore. I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide if I should say something. Eventually, I shook my head and changed the subject, but it stuck with me. Here I was, living on a tight budget, making every dollar count, while Evan spent money on things he didn't need. And when his bad decisions caught up with him, I was the one cleaning up the mess. The breaking point came about 6 months after the rent situation. Evan called me out of the blue, his voice tight with panic. Alex, my car broke down again, he said. I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't get to work without it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. What happened? I asked. I don't know. Something with the engine, I think. The mechanic said it's going to be $1,200 to fix. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. Evan, I can't keep bailing you out. I helped you with your rent. I helped you before that. I don't have that kind of money lying around. But Alex, he said, his voice rising, if I can't get to work, I'll lose my job. Then I won't be able to pay for anything. I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the weight of responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't seem to shake. I knew if I didn't help him, things would spiral. So, against my better judgment, I transferred the money. Thanks, man, he said, sounding relieved. I'll pay you back as soon as I can. But I knew better by then. A few weeks later, my mom called me. Alex, I just wanted to check in on how you're doing, she started. I'm fine, Mom, I said, waiting for the real reason she called. She didn't keep me waiting long. You know, Evan's been having a rough time lately. He mentioned his car trouble. I told him you'd probably help. I gritted my teeth. I already did, I said. I sent him the money for the repair. Oh, that's good, she said, sounding relieved. I knew you'd come through for him. He really looks up to you, you know. I didn't respond. What was the point? As time went on, the calls from my mom became more frequent. Each time, it was some variation of the same theme. Evan was struggling, Evan needed help, and I was the one who could step in. Alex, it's just one more time, she'd say. Alex, he's trying so hard. Alex, you know how much he depends on you. I tried to set boundaries, but it felt impossible. Every time I said no, my mom would remind me of how much she'd sacrificed for us when we were kids. Do you think I wanted to work 2 jobs, Alex? She'd say. I did what I had to do because we're a family. That's what families do. They take care of each other. It didn't seem to matter that Evan wasn't taking care of himself. The worst part was, Evan wasn't even trying to hide how comfortable he'd become with this setup. When I confronted him about his spending, he shrugged it off. Come on, Alex, he said. It's not like I'm living large. Everyone needs a little break sometimes. I wanted to scream, but instead, I stayed quiet. Then came the latest call. It was a few weeks ago. My mom started with the usual small talk, asking how work was going and if I'd seen the latest update in the family group chat. I knew what was coming before she even said it. Evan's landlord is threatening to evict him again, she said. He's behind on rent. It's not his fault, Alex. He's been trying so hard, but he just can't catch a break. I clenched my jaw. Mom, I can't do it this time, I said. I don't have the money. There was a long pause. I'm not asking you to do this for him, she said finally. I'm asking you to do this for the family. We have to stick together. Mom, I'm sorry, I said, but I can't. I've already given him more than I can afford. Her voice sharpened. You're in a better position than most people your age, Alex. Don't you think you should use that privilege to help your brother? I bit back a bitter laugh. You think I'm privileged? I said. Mom, I'm barely keeping my head above water. I have rent, student loans, bills. She cut me off. You don't understand what it's like for him. You've always been the responsible one. You don't know what it's like to struggle like he does. That's when I lost it. I've been struggling for years, Mom, I said. The difference is, I figured out how to handle it without relying on someone else to fix everything for me. The conversation ended badly. She hung up, furious, and I was left feeling drained and defeated. I knew this couldn't go on. Every time I helped Evan, it only delayed the inevitable. He needed to take responsibility for his life, and I couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability to save him from himself. But knowing that didn't make it any easier, because the moment I stopped helping, I became the villain. And in this family, there's no worse role to play. The fallout from saying no to my mom hit harder than I expected. The day after our argument, I woke up to a flood of text messages from her, each one laced with guilt and frustration. She accused me of turning my back on my family, of forgetting where I came from, and of being selfish for refusing to help Evan. You don't understand what it's like for him, one message read. You're his older brother. He looks up to you. Don't let him down. Another said, I didn't raise you to be so cold, Alex. Family comes first. Always. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't know what to say that I hadn't already said. Evan wasn't far behind. He called me later that day, his voice shaking with anger. How could you do this to me? He shouted. Do you even care? Do you even understand what I'm going through? I tried to keep my tone calm. Evan, I've helped you twice already. I can't keep doing this. You need to figure it out. Figure it out? He repeated, incredulous. You think I'm not trying? Do you have any idea how hard it is to get ahead when you're constantly behind? You don't know what it's like to struggle, Alex. You've had everything handed to you. That last line hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Everything handed to me? The years I spent working 2 jobs after college to pay down my student loans, the nights I skipped meals because my paycheck didn't stretch far enough, the sacrifices I made to build some semblance of stability, all of it erased with one sentence. You're unbelievable, I said, my voice cold. I've been struggling for years, Evan. I've just learned how to handle it without dragging everyone else down with me. The call ended in a shouting match, with him accusing me of abandoning him and me refusing to back down. That night, Mom called me again. Her voice was raw, almost pleading. Alex, this isn't who you are, she said. You're better than this. You've always been the responsible one, the kind one. Don't let this harden your heart. I clenched the phone, my patience wearing thin. Mom, I've done everything I can. Helping him hasn't fixed anything. It's just made things worse. He's not taking responsibility for his life, and I'm not going to keep enabling him. She didn't want to hear it. He's your brother, she said sharply. If you turn your back on him now, how is he supposed to get through this? Family is supposed to stick together, no matter what. The conversation ended the same way the last one had. her hanging up, angry and disappointed, and me feeling like I was the worst person on the planet. The fallout didn't stop there. Somehow, my mom managed to rally the extended family, sharing her version of the story with anyone who would listen. By the next day, I was getting texts and calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all chiming in with their opinions. "Hey, Alex, what's going on with you and Evan?" one cousin asked, trying to sound neutral but clearly fishing for details. Another sent me a vague text that said, "Family is everything. Don't forget that." The real kicker came when my aunt, who's always been close to my mom, posted something on Facebook about how some people forget their roots when they get a little success. She didn't name names, but I knew exactly who she was talking about. I wanted to scream. Instead, I muted the family group chat and logged off social media. Meanwhile, Evan was doing his part to fuel the fire. My sister, Lauren, called me a few days later and mentioned that Evan had been posting vague, passive-aggressive updates on social media. Stuff like, "It's hard when the people you love the most turn their backs on you," and "You think you know someone, but money changes everything," Lauren said. "Of course he is," I muttered. Lauren hesitated. "Look, Alex, I get why you're upset, but maybe you could have handled this differently. He's in a really bad spot right now." "Lauren," I said, my voice firm, "I've given him everything I could, and it's never enough. At some point, he has to figure it out on his own. I can't keep sacrificing myself to save him from his own choices." She didn't argue, but she didn't exactly agree either. Evan's spiral continued. Word got back to me that he was reaching out to other family members, trying to borrow money. Most of them turned him down, and a few even reached out to me to ask what was going on. "I don't know how you put up with it for so long," one cousin said. Another aunt mentioned that she'd suspected for years that Evan was taking advantage of me but didn't want to interfere. It was weird, hearing support from people who'd been silent until now. Part of me was grateful, but another part of me wondered where they'd been when I'd needed someone to back me up. At this point, the tension between me and my mom was unbearable. Every call felt like a fight waiting to happen, and every text she sent was dripping with guilt and disappointment. "You're tearing this family apart," she said during one particularly heated phone call. "You're supposed to be the one who keeps us together." "Mom, that's not my job," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't keep fixing everyone else's problems. I have my own life to deal with." She didn't want to hear it. "If you don't help him, I'll have to," she said, "even though I can't afford it." "Is that what you want? For me to lose everything because you're too selfish to step up?" Her words felt like a punch to the gut, but I stood my ground. Evan, meanwhile, wasn't doing much to help his case. From what Lauren told me, he was still working odd jobs and spending money on things he didn't need. She mentioned seeing him out at a bar with friends one night, even though he claimed he was broke. "He's not even trying," I said to Lauren. "I know," she admitted, "but he's not going to change overnight, Alex. You can't just expect him to turn his life around all at once." "I'm not expecting that," I said, "but I am expecting him to start taking responsibility for himself. And I'm not going to keep bailing him out until he does." The hardest part of all this was knowing that, no matter how right I felt about my decision, I'd become the villain in my family's eyes. My mom, my brother, even some of the extended relatives, they all saw me as the bad guy. But what none of them seemed to understand was how much this was costing me. Not just financially, but emotionally. Every time I helped Evan, it chipped away at my own stability, my own sense of self-worth. I was tired of being the safety net, the one who always stepped in to fix things. I knew I'd made the right decision, but the fallout was brutal. And the worst part was, I had no idea when, or if, it would ever get better. The silence between me and my mom didn't last long. A week after our last argument, she called again, this time sounding even more desperate. I could tell she was gearing up for another round of guilt trips. "Alex," she started, her voice heavy, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. Your brother is barely holding on. I've had to step in to help him with rent, but I can't keep this up. You're forcing me into a corner here." I felt my stomach tighten. "I'm not forcing you to do anything, Mom. He's an adult. He needs to figure this out." Her tone sharpened. "Don't talk to me like I'm the problem. I'm trying to hold this family together. You don't understand what it's like to watch your child struggle." I sighed, trying to keep my frustration in check. I do understand, Mom. I've watched him struggle for years. The difference is, I don't think we're helping him by constantly bailing him out. She didn't want to hear it. You think this is easy for me? You think I like having to choose between paying my bills and helping my son? If you just stepped in, this wouldn't be happening. I wanted to scream, but instead, I stayed quiet, letting her words wash over me. When she finally hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. Meanwhile, Evan was still Evan. From what I heard through the family grapevine, he'd started applying for jobs more regularly, but they were the same unrealistic positions he'd always aimed for. Jobs he wasn't qualified for or ones that didn't pay enough to make a real difference. Lauren called me one evening to vent about something unrelated, but eventually, the conversation circled back to Evan. You know he's still spending money on nonsense, right? She said. What do you mean? I asked. Well, for starters, he's still ordering takeout almost every night. And the other day, he posted about buying a new smartwatch. Meanwhile, he's telling everyone he's broke. I laughed bitterly. Of course he is. Why am I not surprised? Lauren sighed. It's frustrating, Alex. But at least he's starting to realize he can't keep relying on everyone. Most of the families stopped giving him money. That was a small relief, but it didn't do much to ease my frustration. Things came to a head a few weeks later when Mom called me with an ultimatum of her own. If you won't help Evan, then I have no choice but to keep stepping in, she said. But if I end up in financial trouble because of it, that's on you. I felt my jaw clench. Mom, that's not fair. You can't blame me for his choices or yours. She didn't back down. You're the one who could stop all this, Alex. You're the one who's choosing not to help, because helping hasn't worked. I snapped. Every time I bail him out, he just falls right back into the same habits. He needs to take responsibility for himself, and you need to stop enabling him. Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice quieter, but no less sharp. I don't know who you've become, Alex. You used to care about this family. Now it feels like you only care about yourself. That one stung. At this point, I was at my wit's end. The constant back and forth with my mom, the endless cycle of Evan's poor decisions, and the guilt weighing on me from every direction. It was too much. I decided to call my dad. He and my mom split when I was in high school, and while he's not as involved in our day-to-day lives, he's always been level-headed and fair. If anyone could give me a sense of perspective, it was him. I laid everything out for him. How much I'd loaned Evan, the fights with Mom, the way it felt like I was being forced into a role I never wanted. Dad listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. Alex, you're not wrong to feel the way you do, he said. Your brother does need to step up, and your mom needs to let him. But you have to understand, she's not going to change overnight. And Evan, well, he's going to have to hit rock bottom before he realizes he needs to change. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. So what do I do? I asked. Hold your ground, he said. It's going to be hard, but you can't let them guilt you into going back. You're not helping him by enabling him. You're just prolonging the inevitable. His words stayed with me long after the call ended. Not long after that conversation, Evan reached out to me again. He sent a long message, apologizing for how he'd acted. At first, I thought it might be genuine. He said he regretted lashing out and admitted he hadn't been managing his life well. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. By the end of the message, he was asking if I could help him just one last time so he could get back on track. I stared at my phone, my frustration mounting. It was the same song and dance, just packaged differently. I took a deep breath and typed out my response. Evan, I appreciate the apology, but I can't give you any more money. If you want my help, it has to come in the form of advice or support, not handouts. You need to show me that you're serious about making changes before I can even consider helping again. I hit send and braced myself for his reaction. His response came quickly and was exactly what I expected. He accused me of being selfish and uncaring, of turning my back on him when he needed me most. He said I didn't understand how hard things were for him, and he ended the message by saying he couldn't believe I'd treat him this way. I didn't respond. The rift in my family felt permanent. My mom barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was clear she hadn't forgiven me. Evan stopped reaching out altogether, and when I asked Lauren about him, she said he wasn't doing much better. Still, I held firm. Every time I felt tempted to step back in, I reminded myself that this wasn't about abandoning my brother. It was about giving him the push he needed to finally grow up. I wasn't sure if he'd ever see it that way. I wasn't sure if my mom would either. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally doing what was right, not just for me, but for the family as a whole. And for now, that had to be enough. In the weeks after I told Evan I wouldn't help him anymore, the dust started to settle. Or at least, it felt like it. Mom's calls became less frequent, though when they did come, they were filled with thinly veiled disappointment. She didn't have to say much. I could hear it in her tone, in the sighs between her words, and in the way she lingered on phrases like, "I just don't know how we got here." Evan, for his part, stuck to his usual routine of avoiding responsibility. According to Lauren, he was still picking up the occasional gig, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover his bills. His social media was still littered with vague posts about betrayal and hardship, earning him a steady stream of sympathy from friends who didn't know the full story. At first, it was infuriating. It felt like no one in the family understood what I was trying to do. To them, I was the bad guy, the selfish older brother who had turned his back on his struggling sibling. But over time, something changed. I started hearing from relatives who had kept quiet before. My cousin Jenna called me one evening to check in. "Hey, Alex," she said. "I just wanted to say, I get it. What you're doing. It's not easy, but it's the right thing." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Thanks," I said. "I wasn't sure anyone else saw it that way." "Trust me, we do," she said. "We've all seen how Evan relies on you and your mom. It's not fair to you. I think setting boundaries is the best thing you could have done. For both of you." Hearing that from someone outside the immediate chaos gave me a sense of validation I hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, my own life started to stabilize. With no more surprise handouts draining my bank account, I was finally able to catch up on a few lingering bills and even put some money into savings, a luxury I hadn't been able to afford in years. It felt good to have control over my finances again. It felt even better to know that I wasn't constantly waiting for the next call, asking me to fix someone else's problems. But the silence didn't last forever. About a month after our last interaction, Evan sent me another message. This time, it was different. There was no anger, no accusations, no manipulation. Instead, it was a genuine apology. "Alex," he wrote, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I realize now that I haven't been fair to you. I've been leaning on you and Mom for too long, and I know I've let both of you down. I'm going to try to do better." For the first time in years, I believed him. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to be sure I wasn't falling into the same old pattern of hoping for change that never came. But after a few days, I sent him a message back. "I appreciate the apology, Evan," I wrote. "It means a lot. I'm glad you're starting to see things differently. If you need advice or support, I'm here for you. But I can't go back to fixing everything for you. You need to do this on your own." His response was simple. "I understand. Thank you." Not long after that, Mom called me again. To my surprise, the tone of the conversation was different. Softer. "I talked to Evan," she said. "He told me what you said. I think he's finally starting to realize he can't keep doing this." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "I hope so, Mom. I really do." There was a pause on the line before she spoke again. "I want you to know, I've been hard on you, and I'm sorry for that. I've always been so scared of losing this family. I didn't want to see it fall apart." "We're not falling apart, Mom," I said. "But sometimes, letting people struggle a little is the only way they can grow. I think Evan's starting to understand that. And I think you are too." Her voice cracked slightly when she responded. "Maybe I am." Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to improve. Evan found a part-time job at a local hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it gave him enough to start covering his basics. Lauren told me he'd even started budgeting, cutting back on the unnecessary expenses that had kept him in such a bad spot for so long. He's not perfect, she said, but he's trying. For the first time in years, it felt like real progress. Mom and I started talking more regularly, and while there was still a lingering tension in some of our conversations, it felt like we were both trying. One day, I brought up the idea of family therapy again, half expecting her to shut it down like before. To my surprise, she hesitated, then said, "Maybe we could give it a try." We scheduled a session a few weeks later. It wasn't a magical fix, nothing ever is, but it gave us a neutral space to talk about everything. The resentment, the misunderstandings, the guilt. It wasn't easy, but it felt like a step in the right direction. By the end of the year, things had settled into a new normal. Evan and I weren't as close as we once were, but our relationship was starting to heal. He reached out occasionally, not to ask for money, but to update me on his progress or ask for advice. Mom and I were on better terms too. There were still moments where she'd slip back into her old ways, but they were fewer and farther between. It felt like she was finally starting to understand that stepping back didn't mean abandoning the family. It meant giving it the space to grow. Looking back on everything, I can see how much this experience changed me. For years, I thought being there for my family meant saying yes to everything, no matter the cost. But I've learned that real support isn't about sacrificing yourself. It's about setting boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable, and holding people accountable, even when it's hard. I won't lie and say it was easy. It wasn't, but it was worth it. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again. And while things with my family will never be perfect, they don't have to be. We're all learning, in our own ways, how to move forward. And for now, that's enough.